Our previous video covered salvation through the death of Jesus, but what about his resurrection? Christians are very good at talking about salvation through the sacrifice of Jesus on Good Friday, but we do often neglect the saving significance of the resurrection. The resurrection, in my opinion, means first and foremost the acceptance of the life and the work and the sacrifice of Jesus by the Father. In the resurrection, we find that the Father accepts the life of Jesus. And importantly, in the resurrection, instead of counteracting against the death of Jesus, instead of rejecting the death of Jesus, the Father accepts it and even uses the death of Jesus in his plan of salvation. From another perspective, we can say that the resurrection gives full meaning to the death of Jesus. And in that way, the death and resurrection of Jesus are not two contradictory events, but they are the one event in the sacrifice of Jesus, remembering what a sacrifice is. Not a pagan sacrifice that purchases influence with God, but a sacrifice of love and dedication. I would argue that the death and resurrection of Jesus work together, not separately. Together, they bring about the defeat of evil, sin, and death, and they bring new life to those who follow Jesus. I found a great way of considering the saving death and resurrection of Jesus is through the theologian Sebastian Moore. I recommend very highly his book, The Crucified Jesus is No Stranger. And he argues that we need to come to grips with the message of contradiction that is contained in the death and resurrection of Jesus. Even though they work together, there are contradictions that bring about our salvation. In the crucifixion, we have probably the ultimate evil act that human beings have ever committed, putting to death the innocent Son of God. Here's a question. How would human justice deal with that situation? I think that our human notion of justice would be that at bare minimum, God would just abandon us and to say, these humans are useless. They don't deserve the grace of God. They should be left alone, not helped. At the other extreme, I would say that human justice would say that God should have destroyed the world, punished and killed, destroyed every human being for crucifying Jesus. But is that divine justice? Is that God's justice? Is this the justice of Almighty God we read about in the Scriptures? What we find then at a human level is a contradiction. The most wicked of human evils is taken by God and turned, transformed into the event of our redemption. I'll quote Sebastian Moore here from The Crucified Jesus is No Stranger. He puts it this way: "It was the feast of the Sacred Heart, and they were singing the first anthem of Vespers. One of the soldiers opened his side with a spear, and immediately there came out blood and water." Moore continues, "Quietly, and with a part of the mind that does not wrestle with concepts, I knew that the whole thing was there. The act of aggression of sin releasing the waters of grace." I think Sebastian Moore captures a beautiful insight there. It's not just accurate, it's beautiful. That what God does is take on an aggressive evil act and doesn't stop it because God respects free will, but he transforms it. He transforms evil into good. He transforms sin into grace. And this is only possible if we take together the death and the resurrection of Jesus. Together, they represent the supreme redemptive act of God, because in this event, God takes on the fallenness of humanity. He engages the sinfulness of people and transforms these into an event of universal forgiveness. There are a number of aspects, a number of dimensions to this mystery, but one of them that I find very helpful to consider is that in the death and resurrection of Jesus, in our worst moment, in the event that summarizes the worst of humanity, God makes the ultimate statement that he loves us and embraces us as his own. That statement of God's love is captured in the prayer of Jesus to the Father. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. We might want to compare the way that we would respond to such a situation. If people had taken one of my children and tortured and killed them, to be honest, my first instinct response would not be mercy. I would feel like doing something completely different. But that's not the way that God works. The God of Israel instead manifests the victory of his loving forgiveness. Even in the face of the ultimate wrongdoing of his creatures, God shows forgiving love. And what the death and resurrection of Jesus do is they show that not just this one event, but the whole of human history is under the mantle, if you like, of the forgiveness and the redemption that's brought about by God. In other words, the death and resurrection of Jesus show that we are all humans for all time, definitively under the forgiving love of God in Jesus Christ. Another way of considering the redemption is that God's unbounded love and acceptance of us is made more manifest, because in the crucifixion, God definitively says, despite your worst failings, I still love you. And I think it's important to note that this is only possible within a Jewish notion of sacrifice and the love of God. Under the different pagan ideas we've had of sacrifice in the past and in fact the present, this isn't possible. But if you have a God of constant love, then this affirmation, this notion of sacrifice, this notion of universal love and forgiveness is possible. So, in the Father's acceptance of the sacrifice of Jesus and his acceptance of all people, these are things which are sealed in the resurrection, which assures us of the Father's approval of Jesus. And there's a key word I like to use here, and that is transformation. The resurrection takes on suffering, evil, sin, and death, and transforms them. In the resurrection, death has no power. Death is no longer the final horror. Death is only the vehicle to transformed, forgiven, glorified, resurrected new life. Evil has no power in the face of the resurrection, because evil itself is no longer just a horrifying force of destruction, but it is turned around, flipped over, and becomes the avenue to renewed, grace-filled life in the love of God.